The gun was still smoking when Ezra Blackwood realized what he'd done. Two men lay dead in the Texas dust, their blood mixing with the desert sand outside Brownsville. One had a hole clean through his chest. The other's face was gone. The woman stared at him through swollen eyes, her 6-year-old daughter clinging to her torn skirts. He'd come for weapons, a crate of black market Colts to sell up north. That was the deal. Simple. Instead, he'd just become a killer again. He looked at the bodies, then at the woman, and a cold dread washed over him. This wasn't supposed to happen. He was a businessman now, a purveyor of tools for a dangerous world. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't a savior. He was just a man trying to outrun his own shadow. The traffickers had called it clearing inventory, unwanted merchandise, bound for the worst kind of hell imaginable in the brothel wagons that followed the railroad lines. But when the little girl named Elena, bit the man's hand as he dragged her mother toward the wagon, something ancient and terrible snapped inside the former Union cavalry officer. He hadn't even thought. The Colt was in his hand, barking fire and thunder, and then there was just silence, the ringing in his ears, the smell of gun smoke, and two dead men at his feet. Now Catalina Morales and her daughter Elena stood free, and Ezra Blackwood was something much worse than a gun runner. He was a wanted man, a man who had just cost a very dangerous organization 2 employees and a valuable piece of property. In the distance, the sound of hoofbeats echoed across the plains. Not a posse, not yet. It was worse. It was the rest of them, the rest of the trafficking ring, coming to see what the commotion was. He looked at the woman and child, their faces pale with terror. He looked at the bodies, the evidence of his crime, and he looked toward the sound of the approaching riders. He had 2 choices: run and leave them to their fate, or take them with him and seal his own. He made a decision that would change everything. He grabbed the woman's arm. "Come on, now!" Catalina flinched, pulling her daughter closer. Her eyes, dark and full of a pain he knew all too well, darted from his face to the gun still in his hand. She thought he was just another monster, a different kind of monster. "My horse is over the ridge," he said, his voice a low growl. "We ride now, or we all die here." The hoofbeats were getting closer, a drumbeat of approaching doom. He didn't have time to be gentle. He scooped the little girl into his arms, she was terrifyingly light, and started running, pulling Catalina behind him. He didn't look back. You never look back. They crested the ridge just as the first of the riders came into view, their shapes shimmering in the brutal Texas heat. Ezra's horse, a big roan gelding named Absalom, whinnied nervously. He threw the child up into the saddle, then mounted behind her, reaching down to haul Catalina up behind him. She came without a fight, her body rigid with fear. "Hold on," he grunted and spurred the horse into a gallop. The ride was a brutal, desperate flight, 3 of them on one horse, pushing the animal to its limit. The traffickers were behind them, shouting curses in Spanish, their gunshots cracking through the air. Bullets whizzed past their heads, kicking up plumes of dust. Ezra rode low, shielding the woman and child with his own body, the familiar motions of a cavalry charge coming back to him like a bad dream. He knew this land. He knew its secrets, its hidden trails, its merciless terrain. He pushed Absalom into a narrow arroyo, the steep walls echoing the horse's labored breathing. For a moment, they were hidden from view, but he knew it wouldn't last. These were not stupid men. They were hunters. He had to get them somewhere safe, and there was only one place he could think of, a place so remote, so forgotten, that no one would ever think to look for them. His ranch, a 40-acre patch of hell he called home, a place where he'd gone to be alone, to forget the man he used to be, the man he had just become again. The sun was setting when they finally reached the hollow between the mesquite-covered hills. The cabin was little more than a shack, but to Ezra it was a fortress. No neighbors, no law, no questions asked. Until now. Catalina hadn't spoken a single word during the entire ride. She sat stiff as a board behind him, her arms wrapped tightly around her daughter, her dark eyes scanning the horizon like a trapped animal looking for an escape. When they reached the cabin, she slid down from the horse before he could even offer a hand, stumbling slightly on the hard-packed earth. "You can sleep in the back room," Ezra said. his voice rough from dust and disuse. He dismounted, his body aching from the ride. There's clean water, food. She just stared at him, her face a mask of suspicion. She studied his weathered face, the deep lines around his green eyes, the 3-day-old stubble on his jaw. She was searching for the catch. In her world, there was always a catch. What do you want from us? Her voice was a hoarse whisper, but the question hung in the evening air like gun smoke. It was the same question every victim asked their captor, and right now she had no reason to believe he was anything else. Ezra didn't answer right away. He pulled the heavy saddle from Absalom's back, his movements deliberate, controlled. It was the same economy of motion he'd used just hours earlier, before killing those men. He was a man who wasted nothing. Not words, not movements, not bullets. He finally looked at her, his gaze unwavering. Nothing you don't want to give. But Catalina knew better than to trust a man's words, especially a man who could kill 2 people without a flicker of hesitation and then ride away as if he were just leaving a Sunday social. She had been bought and sold by men who spoke gentle words. She knew that the most dangerous monsters were the ones who pretended they weren't. That first night, she barricaded the bedroom door with the only chair in the room. She found a small kitchen knife and tucked it under the thin pillow, its cool steel a small, cold comfort. Elena slept fitfully beside her, whimpering in Spanish, her small body trembling with the memory of the day's horrors. Through the thin wooden walls, Catalina could hear Ezra moving around the main room, the heavy tread of his boots on the rough, hewn floorboards, the scrape of a chair, the clink of a whiskey bottle against a glass. Pacing, drinking, waiting. She didn't sleep. She couldn't. Earlier, when he'd rolled up his sleeves to wash the blood from his hands and arms at the well, she'd seen the scars. A patchwork of old wounds crisscrossed his forearms. White lines from knives, puckered craters from bullets, the ragged, angry marks of war. This man had killed long before today. This was not a new path for him. It was a well-trodden one. By the time the first gray light of dawn crept through the cracks in the walls, she had made her decision. They would leave. As soon as he was gone, or asleep, they would take his horse if they had to. They would ride for the border, for Mexico, for the sister she had in a small village in Sonora. They would disappear. She eased the chair away from the door, the wood scraping loudly in the oppressive silence. Holding her breath, she slowly pulled the door open, and her heart stopped. Elena's spot on the bed was empty. The blanket was thrown aside. She was gone. A cold, raw panic shot through Catalina like a lightning strike. She ran into the main room, her bare feet slapping against the cold, dusty floors. The room was empty. A half-empty bottle of whiskey sat on the table. The front door was slightly ajar. He'd taken her. The monster had finally shown his true face. He'd waited, lulled her into a false sense of security, and then he'd taken her daughter. She burst through the door into the blinding morning sun, a scream building in her throat, and then she saw them. They were by the well. Ezra was kneeling in the dirt, his large scarred hands patiently guiding Elena's tiny ones on the rope. He was showing her how to draw water. The bucket was too heavy for her, but he let her feel the weight of it, let her feel like she was the one doing the work. He wasn't a monster. He was a teacher. A small, hesitant smile touched the corner of the child's lips. It was the first time Catalina had seen her smile in weeks, maybe months. "Mama!" Elena called when she spotted her, her voice bright and clear. "Senor Ezra says I'm strong. Strong like Papa was." Catalina's breath caught in her chest, a painful, ragged gasp. Elena hadn't mentioned her father since he'd been taken by the fever that swept through their village. The memory was too terrible, too final. But here, in this desolate place, with this dangerous man, her daughter was remembering her father's strength. Ezra looked up, his green eyes meeting Catalina's across the dusty yard. And in that one long, silent moment, something passed between them. It wasn't trust. Not yet. It was something far more fragile. A flicker of recognition. 2 broken people, who had lost everything they'd ever loved, trying to protect the little that remained. "She's hungry," he said, his voice flat, stating a simple fact. "I was making breakfast." He stood up, his tall frame blocking out the morning sun. For the first time, She saw him not as a killer or a captor, but just as a man with secrets and scars, but a man nonetheless. She followed him back inside. The cabin smelled of coffee and frying bacon. It was a simple, honest smell, but it was more than they'd had in months. On the rough wooden table, 3 plates were set, 3 tin cups. He moved around the small kitchen with a surprising grace for such a large, powerful man. When he set a plate of eggs and bacon in front of Elena, he did so without hovering, without demanding thanks. He just provided. Catalina watched him as he poured the coffee. It was black, bitter, and strong. The kind of coffee you drink to stay awake when you know danger is riding on the wind. "Those men you killed," she said, her voice quiet while Elena ate ravenously. "Others will come looking for them." "I know." He didn't look at her. He just stared into the black depths of his coffee cup, as if searching for an answer he knew he wouldn't find. "Why did you do it?" she asked, the question she'd been afraid to voice all night. "You were there for guns, not for us." Ezra was silent for a long time. The only sound was the scrape of Elena's fork against the tin plate. In the morning light, Catalina could see the threads of gray in his dark hair, the lines carved deep around his eyes that had seen far too much of the world's ugliness. Finally, he lifted his gaze to hers. "Because something," he said slowly, deliberately, "are worth the risk." And in his eyes, Catalina saw not the cold emptiness of a killer, but the weary soul of a soldier. A man who understood that every choice has a consequence, and that sometimes you make the choice anyway. But outside, high above the mesquite, a hawk circled in the endless blue sky. It was waiting, watching, just like the men who would eventually come for them. They all knew it was only a matter of time. The quiet was just a pause, a breath before the screaming started again. 3 weeks passed, 3 weeks of an uneasy peace, a fragile routine built in the shadow of impending violence. Ezra would rise before dawn, his movements quiet as he tended to the horse and chopped wood. Catalina would cook, clean, and watch over Elena, who was slowly, miraculously, starting to act like a child again. She would follow Ezra around the small ranch, asking endless questions, her laughter a sound Catalina thought she might never hear again. They didn't talk about the past. They didn't talk about the future. They existed only in the present, a small, makeshift family of 3, bound together by a single act of violence. Catalina found herself watching him. She watched his hands, how they could be so gentle when mending a fence or showing Elena how to carve a piece of wood, and how they rested so naturally on the butt of his Colt. She saw the way he checked the horizon every morning and every evening, his eyes scanning for any sign of dust, any movement that didn't belong. He was a man living on borrowed time, and he knew it. One evening she found him cleaning his rifle on the porch, the setting sun glinting off the oiled steel. "You were a soldier," she said. It wasn't a question. He nodded, not looking up from his work. "Union Cavalry, 4th Texas. You fought against your own people." He finally stopped, his hands going still. He looked out at the vast, empty landscape. "Sometimes you have to," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "when your people are wrong." A silence fell between them, thick with unspoken things. She was beginning to understand him, this man of contradictions, this killer with a code, this Southerner who fought for the North. He wasn't a simple man, and that made him even more dangerous, because she was starting to trust him. And then the fever came. It started with a small cough, a shiver that wouldn't stop. By the second day, Elena's small body was burning like a forge. Her skin was hot and dry to the touch, her eyes glassy and unfocused. She cried out in her sleep, her words a jumbled mix of Spanish and English. Typhoid. Catalina knew it instantly. She had seen it before, back in Sonora. It had swept through her village like a phantom, taking half the population with it. It had taken her husband. She knelt by the small bed, pressing a cool, damp cloth to Elena's forehead, her heart a cold, hard knot of fear in her chest. "We need medicine," she whispered, her voice choked with desperation. "Quinine. From town." Ezra stood in the doorway, his hat in his hands, his face grim. They both knew what going to town meant. By now, the story of the 2 dead traffickers would have spread. There would be posters, His name, his description, Ezra Blackwood, armed and dangerous, reward for information leading to his capture. "I'll go at first light," he said, his voice low and steady. "They'll recognize you," she pleaded, her eyes welling with tears. "You'll be walking into a trap." "Maybe." He settled the hat on his head, his jaw set in a hard line. "But she'll die without it." He turned to leave, and she scrambled to her feet, catching his wrist. His skin was warm and rough, calloused from work and weapons. She had watched these hands gentle a spooked horse, mend a broken fence, stroke Elena's hair when the child cried out in her fever dreams. "Don't go," she breathed, the words tearing from her throat. "Please, we'll find another way. There has to be another way. There is no other way, Catalina." Over the past few weeks, a dangerous thing had happened. She had grown accustomed to his presence. The quiet way he moved through the cabin, the low hum of old war songs he'd whistle under his breath, the small kindnesses he'd offer without explanation. A wildflower left on the kitchen table, an extra blanket on a cold night. He had maintained a careful, respectful distance, never pushing, never demanding, never taking what she wasn't willing to give. She had begun to trust him. And more dangerous still, she had begun to want him. "If you go to town, you won't come back," she said, her voice breaking. "And then what happens to us?" Ezra's eyes darkened with an emotion she couldn't quite read. Pain? Regret? Slowly, deliberately, he reached up and covered her hand with his. His palm was huge, dwarfing hers, a landscape of scars and weathered skin. But his touch was infinitely gentle. "Then you take the horse," he said softly. "You ride south. There's money hidden in the floorboards of the barn. Enough to get you and Elena back to Mexico. Enough to start over." He had a plan for them to survive without him. He was ready to trade his life for theirs. "This is home," she whispered. The words surprised them both. They hung in the air, unexpected and undeniable. She hadn't meant to say them, but as soon as they were out, she knew they were true. In this rough, isolated cabin, with this dangerous, gentle man, she had found something she thought she had lost forever. Safety, peace, the possibility of something more. "Catalina," he breathed her name, and it was a question, a plea, a warning, all at once. She stepped closer to him, into his space, close enough to smell the scent of leather and wood smoke and whiskey that clung to him, close enough to see the pulse beating at the base of his throat. They had been dancing around this for weeks, this charged space between them, the stolen glances, the way the air crackled whenever they passed each other in the small cabin. The dance was over. "Stay," she whispered, and rising on her toes, she brushed her lips against his. It was a kiss born of desperation and fear and a terrible, aching longing. It was a kiss that knew everything could end with the rising of the sun. For a moment, Ezra went rigid, his body tense as a coiled spring. Then, with a low groan, his arms came around her, pulling her tight against the solid, warm wall of his chest. His kiss was no longer gentle. It was hungry, demanding, a raw expression of all the loneliness and pain he'd held inside for years. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard, their foreheads pressed together. "I have to go," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't hide. "You know I do." She did know, just as she knew he might not return. That was the price of loving a wanted man in a lawless land. Later that night, Elena's fever seemed to break slightly. She was sleeping peacefully for the first time in days. Leaving her daughter's side, Catalina walked to Ezra's room. The door was open. By the dim light of a single lantern, she saw him sitting on the edge of his bed, meticulously cleaning his Colt revolver, preparing for battle. He looked up as she entered, his eyes asking a silent question. "You don't have to do this," he began, his voice rough. "I know," she said, closing the door softly behind her. "I want to." What happened next was not about love, not yet. It was about something more primal. It was two lonely, broken people clinging to each other in the dark, seeking solace and warmth before the world tried to tear them apart again. His hands, which she had only known to be gentle or deadly, were now reverent on her skin. He traced the curve of her waist, the swell of her breasts, the scars on her back that told their own story of a brutal life. She, in turn, memorized the feel of him, the geography of his own scars, a map of a life forged in violence, the surprising gentleness in his touch that contradicted everything his reputation suggested. They made no promises. They spoke no words of love. They simply gave each other the comfort of another human being, a shield against the cold, lonely dark. When the first light of dawn painted the sky in shades of gray and pink, she watched him dress in silence. The worn jeans, the clean shirt, the leather gun belt, which he buckled with a familiar, practiced motion, the long coat that would hide his weapons. "If I'm not back by sunset," he started to say. "You'll be back," she interrupted, her voice stronger than she felt. She pulled the thin blanket up to her chin, but she couldn't hide the single tear that escaped and traced a path down her cheek. "You have to be." He came to the bed and kissed her one last time. It was a soft, sweet kiss, so different from the desperate passion of the night. It was a kiss full of promises that neither of them could be sure he could keep. Then he was gone. Catalina walked to the cabin window and watched as he rode away, a solitary figure moving toward the distant town, toward whatever fate awaited him there. She watched until he was just a small speck, swallowed by the heat shimmer of the morning. From the back room, Elena called out, her voice weak but clear. "Mama, I'm thirsty." The fever had broken. The medicine wasn't even here yet, but the worst of it was over. Life went on, even when your heart was riding away with a wanted man. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in fiery shades of orange and red. Sunset, and he wasn't back. Catalina paced the length of the small cabin, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach with each passing minute. Elena, weak but lucid, sat at the table, watching her mother with wide, worried eyes. Every gust of wind sounded like hoofbeats. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. And then she heard it, a sound that was real this time, distant at first, then growing louder. Gunshots, not one or two, a volley, like a small war had broken out on the road from town. Catalina's blood turned to ice. She grabbed Elena, pulling the child close as they both peered through the cabin's single window. In the fading light, she could see a cloud of dust rising from the road. Riders, coming fast. Too many riders. "Mama!" Elena's voice was a small, frightened whisper against her chest. "Shh, mija, stay quiet," Catalina breathed, her heart hammering against her ribs. It wasn't a gang of traffickers that crested the hill. It was Ezra. He was hunched low over Absalom's neck, a dark stain of blood spreading across his shirt. And behind him, closing fast, rode three men. They wore badges that glinted in the dying sun. They carried rifles, a sheriff's posse. He'd gotten the medicine. She could see the small glass bottle clutched in his free hand. But he'd paid for it in blood. And now he had led the law right to their door. To her. To Elena. The cabin door burst open and Ezra stumbled inside, his face pale and slick with sweat, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He was swaying on his feet. "They followed me," he gritted out, his voice strained with pain. "Sheriff from Brownsville." He pressed the precious bottle of quinine into her hands, his fingers slick and warm with his own blood. "Take Elena, the root cellar. Hide." "I'm not leaving you," she said, her voice fierce. "God damn it, woman, do as I say," he roared, a flash of the old hard man returning. But it was a bluff. He was leaning heavily against the doorframe, his strength failing. "No." Catalina grabbed his face between her palms, forcing him to meet her eyes. She saw the pain there, but underneath it, the terrible calculation of a man who had fought too many losing battles. He was weighing their lives against his own and finding himself wanting. "We stay together, all of us." Outside, the hoofbeats thundered to a stop. Shouts echoed in the twilight. "Surround the house, Blackwood. We know you're in there. You're under arrest for robbery and murder." Robbery? Murder? It was worse than she thought. Ezra's jaw worked, his gaze darting around the small cabin, looking for an escape that didn't exist. "The root cellar," she said again, her voice urgent and quick. "Under the kitchen floor. You and Elena. Now." "What about you?" he asked, his voice a low groan, as a wave of pain washed over him. She pulled the simple gold wedding band from her finger, the ring her first husband had given her, what felt like a lifetime ago. She pressed it into his hand. "I'm going to buy us some time," she said. Before he could protest, before he could argue, she was at the door. She quickly smoothed her hair, unbuttoned the top two buttons of her dress, and arranged the torn fabric of her skirt. She made herself look like a victim, a terrified, desperate woman, the kind of display that might distract a group of men just long enough for her family to disappear. Her family. When had she started thinking of them that way? She pushed the door open and stepped out onto the porch, raising her hands in surrender. The man in charge was young, maybe 25, with a shiny deputy's badge pinned to his vest and a pair of hard, unforgiving eyes. He had his rifle trained on her chest. "Ma'am," he said, his voice cold and official, "we're looking for a man named Ezra Blackwood, an armed killer. We have reason to believe he's holding you and your child against your will." Catalina let her accent thicken, let her voice shake with a fear that wasn't entirely fake. "Si, senor," she cried, making her eyes wide. "He was here, the devil himself, but he left, maybe an hour ago. He took the last of our food and rode east toward the river." The young deputy's eyes narrowed. He didn't believe her. "Search the house, boys," he ordered. Catalina's heart nearly stopped. It was over. They would find the trap door to the cellar in seconds. But then, a small weak sound drifted up from beneath the kitchen floorboards. A cough, a child's sick, rasping cough. One of the other deputies, an older, more weathered man, paused, his hand on the door. "Sounds like you got a sick kid in there, ma'am," he said, his voice a little softer than his leader's. The young deputy's expression softened, just a fraction. "Fever's been bad this season," he said. "We passed the doc in town. Said his office was robbed this afternoon. All his quinine gone. Said the thief shot a man on his way out. A man, not two. They didn't know about the traffickers. They were here because of the doctor." Catalina seized the opportunity, letting real hot tears stream down her face. "My daughter," she whispered, her voice breaking with genuine emotion. "She has the typhoid. She was dying." She looked the young deputy straight in the eye. "That man, Blackwood, he stole the medicine for her. He saved her life." It wasn't entirely a lie. She didn't fully understand why Ezra had risked everything for them, but she was grateful beyond words that he had. The young lawman looked conflicted. He glanced at his men, then back at the dark, lonely cabin. The story made a certain kind of sense. A desperate woman, a dying child, a wanted man with a flicker of a conscience. "Well," he said finally, lowering his rifle, "he's probably halfway to Mexico by now. We'll ride for the river and see if we can pick up his trail." He tipped his hat to her. "You see him again, ma'am. You send word to town. He's a killer no matter what good deeds he thinks he's done." "Si, senor," she whispered. "Of course." They searched the area around the cabin, their lanterns cutting through the darkness. But they never stepped inside. Why would they? Why would they ever suspect that a frightened, grateful woman would lie to protect a wanted man, especially one who had supposedly held her captive? After they rode off, their hoofbeats fading into the night, Catalina waited a full hour, an hour of agonizing, silent tension. Finally, she went inside, barred the door, and lifted the loose floorboard. Ezra emerged first, his face ashen, his shirt soaked in blood. He was shaking, not from the cold, but from blood loss and shock. He helped Elena out, and the child, pale but alert, ran into Catalina's arms. Ezra leaned against the table, struggling to stay upright. "Why?" he asked, his voice weak. "Why didn't you turn me in? You could have been free." Catalina helped him to a chair, her hands gentle as she began to cut away the bloody fabric of his shirt to examine the wound. The bullet had gone clean through the fleshy part of his side just above his hip. It had missed bone and anything vital. It was painful, bloody, but not fatal. She had seen much worse. She began threading a needle by the flickering lamplight, her movements steady and sure. "Because," she said quietly, not looking at him, "you risked your life for my daughter. You bled for us." She finally lifted her gaze to his, her dark eyes intense and unwavering. "That makes you family." His hand shot out and caught hers, stilling her movements. His touch was weak, but his grip was firm. I can't stay, Catalina. They'll keep looking. They'll be back. Next time, she said, her voice filled with a steely resolve she didn't know she possessed. Next time, we'll be ready. She met his gaze, a silent promise passing between them. Together. Something shifted in his eyes then. The hard shell of the solitary soldier, the lonely man who expected nothing from the world but pain, finally cracked. It cracked just enough to let in a sliver of light, a sliver of hope, a sliver of all the dangerous, beautiful things he'd thought were dead and buried long ago. Together, he repeated, the word a prayer on his lips. That night, as Elena slept peacefully in the back room, the quinine finally doing its work, and as Ezra's wound was cleaned and stitched, Catalina lay in his arms. And in the quiet darkness of the Texas frontier, surrounded by danger and uncertainty, she felt something she hadn't experienced since long before her husband's death. She felt home, but home was about to become a battlefield. The lie she told the posse had bought them time, but it had also set a clock ticking. Because she had a terrible feeling that the young deputy hadn't fully believed her. And when a lawman gets a feeling, he doesn't let it go. He'd be back, and he wouldn't be alone. The next morning, Ezra was weak but stubborn. He was on his feet, his face pale, inspecting the single-shot rifle he kept mounted over the fireplace. They'll come back with more men, he said, his voice strained. They'll tear this place apart, board by board. Then we leave, Catalina said, packing what little food they had into a sack. We ride for Mexico now, before they can return. Ezra shook his head. We won't make it. Not with my side torn open and Elena still weak from the fever. They'd run us down in a day. He limped to the window, peering out at the familiar landscape as if seeing it for the first time as a trap. No, our only chance is to make a stand, right here. A stand? With one rifle and one pistol? Against a whole posse? The idea was insane. It was suicide. Ezra's eyes had a strange glint in them. They think I'm just a killer who got lucky. They don't know who I really am. They don't know what I can do. He looked at her. And they don't know who you are. He limped over to a large dusty trunk in the corner of the room, one she had never seen him open. He knelt and unlocked it. The lid creaked open, revealing not clothes or keepsakes, but an arsenal. 2 more rifles, another pair of Colt revolvers, and boxes upon boxes of ammunition. But that wasn't the most shocking thing inside the trunk. Tucked in the corner was a rolled-up piece of canvas, an old Union cavalry flag, stained and tattered, and beneath it, a formal-looking document sealed with wax. "What is this?" Catalina asked, her voice a whisper. Ezra looked at the document, his face a mask of old pain. "A presidential pardon," he said quietly, "for services rendered to the Union during the war. Services they don't teach you about in the history books. He wasn't just a soldier. He had been something else. Something more secret, more deadly." "Then why are you a wanted man?" she asked, confused. "Why are you hiding out here?" "Because the war didn't end for everyone," he said, his voice bitter. "Some enemies don't forget. The men who own those brothel wagons, I've crossed paths with their organization before. They have long memories, and the law in this part of Texas, it's often for sale to the highest bidder." He looked up at her, his green eyes burning with a cold fire. "That deputy last night, he wasn't just a lawman doing his job. His name is Miller. His brother was one of the traffickers I killed." Catalina felt a chill run down her spine. It wasn't a posse that was coming for them. It was a lynch mob hiding behind badges. This was never about the law. It was about revenge. "So what do we do?" she asked, her own fear turning into a cold, hard anger. "We turn this cabin into a fortress," Ezra said, "and we show them what happens when they corner a wolf." He spent the rest of the day preparing. Despite the pain from his wound, he moved with a grim, terrifying purpose. He showed her how to load and fire the rifles, his hands guiding hers, his voice calm and steady as he explained the mechanics of death. He boarded up most of the windows, leaving only small slits to fire through. He positioned the weapons at different points in the cabin, creating interlocking fields of fire. He was not just a soldier, he was a tactician. He was turning their home into a tomb. As night fell, a heavy, oppressive silence descended on the small cabin. Elena was asleep in the root cellar, safe beneath the floor. Catalina sat with a rifle across her lap, her knuckles white. Ezra stood by the main window, a silhouette against the moonlit landscape, watching, waiting. "I'm sorry I brought this to you," he said without turning around. "You didn't bring it," she said, her voice steady. "You brought us out of it. There's a difference." He finally turned to look at her, a faint, sad smile on his lips. "You know, I came out here to die. Just let the world forget me, fade away." He looked around the small, dark room. "Funny, I haven't felt this alive in years." The sound came just after midnight, a single horse approaching slowly. Not the thunder of a posse, but the cautious advance of a scout. Ezra motioned for her to be silent. He peered through the slit in the wall. A lone rider sat on the ridge overlooking the cabin, a spyglass to his eye. "Miller," Ezra breathed. "He's alone." "Is he giving up?" Catalina whispered, a fragile hope rising in her. "No," Ezra said, his voice grim. "He's drawing us out. He wants me to think I have a chance if I face him one-on-one." Just then, from the opposite direction, another sound drifted through the night. The faint cry of an owl, but it wasn't an owl. It was a signal. They weren't just on the ridge. They were all around them. They had been surrounded. Suddenly, a torch flared to life in the darkness, then another, and another. A ring of fire was closing in on the cabin, the men carrying the torches using them to stay out of the darkest shadows. They were smart. They were boxing them in. A voice called out, amplified by the silence of the night. It was Deputy Miller. "Blackwood, we know you're in there. We have your woman's sister." Catalina's blood ran cold. It was impossible. Her sister was in Sonora, hundreds of miles away. It was a lie, a trick. But then another voice cried out, a woman's voice speaking in Spanish, filled with terror. "Catalina, help me! They have me!" It was her voice. It was her sister's voice. Catalina's mind reeled. How could they have found her? How did they even know about her? A dark, terrible realization dawned on her. The traffickers. When they had captured her, they had taken everything, including the letters from her sister she kept tied in a ribbon. They knew her name. They knew where she lived. This wasn't just about revenge for Miller's brother. This was the whole organization, and they had used her family to set a perfect trap. "It's a lie, Catalina," Ezra said, his voice a low growl. "They're trying to get you to run outside." "But what if it's not?" she cried, the rifle trembling in her hands. "What if they have her?" "Blackwood," Miller shouted again. "Send the woman out. Send her out and we'll let her sister go. You have my word." Ezra looked at Catalina, his face a grim mask. "His word is worth nothing. The moment you step outside that door, you're dead. And then they'll burn this cabin to the ground with me and Elena inside." The woman screamed again, a sound of pure agony that tore through Catalina's heart. She was trapped. If she stayed, her sister would die. If she left, they would all die. She looked at Ezra, her eyes pleading. "What do we do?" Ezra's gaze was fixed on the darkness outside. He was calculating, thinking, his mind working like a machine of war. "They made a mistake," he said softly. "What mistake?" "They lit the torches," he said, a cold, dangerous smile touching his lips. "They think it gives them an advantage, but all it does is make them perfect targets." He raised his rifle, the long barrel resting in the slit in the wall. He took a slow, steady breath, the way he had taught her. He let it out, and then he fired. The night exploded in a flash of light and a deafening roar. Out on the ridge, a man screamed and fell from his horse. The siege had begun. The first shot was a declaration of war. The ring of torches scattered as men scrambled for cover. Gunfire erupted from all sides, bullets thudding into the thick log walls of the cabin. Splinters of wood flew through the air. "Stay down!" Ezra yelled, pulling Catalina away from the window. "They're just trying to pin us down. Don't waste your shots." He moved through the dark cabin like a phantom, from one firing slit to another, never staying in one place for more than a few seconds. He was a ghost, a whisper of death in the night. He would fire a single calculated shot, and a shout of pain would answer from the darkness. He wasn't just shooting at them. He was dismantling them, taking out the men with the rifles first, sowing chaos and fear. Catalina, her heart pounding, crawled to another window. She could hear them shouting, their confidence turning to panic. They had expected a cornered man, desperate and afraid. They had not expected a seasoned commander conducting a defense. She peered through the slit. She saw a man trying to sneak up to the side of the cabin, a jug of oil in his hand. He was going to try to set the house on fire. She remembered Ezra's words. Breathe in, breathe out. Squeeze the trigger, don't pull it. Her hands were slick with sweat, but her aim was steady. She fired. The rifle kicked back hard against her shoulder, bruising her. But the man outside dropped the jug and collapsed, his body still. She had just killed a man. There was no time for shock, no time for remorse. There was only the cold, hard reality of survival. The battle raged for what felt like an eternity. The air in the cabin grew thick with gun smoke, the smell of gunpowder sharp and acrid. They were running low on ammunition for the rifles. We can't hold them off forever, Catalina said, reloading one of the Colt revolvers. They'll rush us at dawn. We won't last till dawn, Ezra said, grabbing his side. His wound had reopened, and a fresh patch of blood was spreading across his shirt. We have to end this now. He looked at her, his eyes blazing with a desperate, brilliant idea. Absalom, the horse is still in the barn. What are you going to do? Create a diversion, he said. They think we're trapped in here. They won't be expecting an attack from the outside. He handed her his last loaded pistol. Give me 10 minutes, then give them hell from the windows. Before she could argue, he was gone, slipping out the back door of the cabin, which was mostly hidden from the main force of the attackers. He disappeared into the darkness like a snake. It was the longest 10 minutes of Catalina's life. Alone in the cabin, with the sound of the enemy creeping closer, she thought about Elena, sleeping soundly in the cellar, unaware of the war being fought for her life. She thought about her sister, a hostage to these monsters. She thought about the man who had just run out into a hail of bullets for them. She would not let him down. Suddenly, a wild, terrifying scream erupted from the direction of the barn. It was followed by the thunder of hoofbeats. Ezra, on Absalom's back, burst out of the darkness, a revolver in each hand, firing into the flank of the attackers. He was a demon on horseback, a whirlwind of death. The attackers, caught completely by surprise, turned their fire on him. That was her signal. Catalina ran to the front window and emptied the pistol into the group of distracted men. They were caught in a crossfire, confused, panicking, their perfect siege collapsing around them. The tide had turned, but the cost was about to be astronomical. She saw Ezra's horse stumble. A lucky shot had found its mark. Absalom went down, throwing Ezra hard to the ground. He lay there stunned as Deputy Miller and two of his remaining men ran toward him, their rifles raised. It was over. He had saved them, but he had sacrificed himself. But then something impossible happened. A volley of gunfire erupted from a new direction, from the woods behind Miller's men. One of the attackers cried out and fell, then another. Miller spun around confused. "Who's there?" he shouted into the darkness. A figure emerged from the trees. He was old, dressed in the dusty clothes of a simple farmer, and he held a long-barreled hunting rifle. But he was not alone. Behind him, more figures emerged. 10, then 20 men. They were farmers, ranchers, townspeople, and they were all armed. "That's far enough, Miller," the old man said, his voice ringing with authority. "You're a disgrace to that badge." It was the town doctor, the man Ezra had supposedly robbed. Miller was stunned. "What is this? This man is a wanted murderer." "No," the doctor said, stepping forward into the firelight. "This man saved my life. Your brother and his friends were trying to rob me when Blackwood showed up. He drove them off. Your brother was shot by one of his own men in the confusion." He looked at Ezra, who was now struggling to his feet. "He never stole that medicine. I gave it to him. For the child." The lie Catalina had told the posse had been closer to the truth than she could have ever imagined. Ezra wasn't a thief. He was a hero. Miller's face contorted with rage. He knew he was beaten. The town had turned against him. His lynch mob was broken, but he was filled with a desperate, venomous hatred. He raised his rifle, not at Ezra, but at the doctor. "This ain't over," he screamed. He never finished the sentence. A single shot rang out, not from the townspeople, not from Ezra, but from the cabin door. Catalina stood there, the smoking rifle in her hands, her face set like stone. Deputy Miller collapsed into the dust, his reign of terror finally over. Silence fell over the battlefield, a profound, ringing silence. Catalina ran to Ezra, helping him to his feet. The townspeople surrounded them, their faces a mixture of awe and relief. The doctor rushed to check Ezra's wounds. From the darkness, a woman's cry was heard. "Catalina!" A group of the ranchers were bringing someone forward. A woman, her hands bound, her face bruised. It was her sister. It hadn't been a trick. They had ridden all the way to Sonora and back. They had brought her here to use as bait. Catalina ran to her, cutting her bonds, the two sisters collapsing into each other's arms, weeping with a joy and relief so profound it hurt. Ezra watched them, a slow smile spreading across his tired, blood-stained face. He had tried to run from the world, to hide from his own humanity, but the world had found him. And in the heart of the fire, surrounded by violence and death, he had not found the end he was looking for. He had found a family. He had found a home. 6 months later, the wanted posters had been torn down, replaced by a new notice signed by the circuit judge. Ezra Blackwood was not a wanted man, but a town hero, cleared of all charges. The corruption of Deputy Miller and his connection to the trafficking ring had been exposed, thanks to the doctor's testimony and the evidence found in the traffickers' camp. The organization's hold on the borderlands was broken. Ezra still limped from the bullet he'd taken that night. He would carry the scar forever, a permanent reminder of the price of redemption. But his hands were gentle as he taught Elena to read on the porch of the rebuilt cabin. The townspeople, as a gesture of their gratitude, had helped him repair the damage from the siege. He was patient as he helped Catalina and her sister, who now lived with them, tend their small but thriving garden. They lived quietly, peacefully. The ghosts of the past were still there, lingering in the shadows, but they no longer had power over them. Some evenings, when Elena was asleep and the desert wind sang its lonely song through the mesquite, Catalina would find Ezra watching the horizon. The old restlessness was still there, the soldier's habit of expecting trouble. "Worried?" she would ask, wrapping her arms around him from behind. "Always," he would reply. But he would turn and pull her close, and his arm around her was not the grip of a man planning to run. It was the embrace of a man determined to stay. She understood. They had found something worth staying for, worth fighting for. It was not a perfect life. It was messy and complicated, built on a foundation of violence and choice rather than quiet circumstance. But it was real. It was solid. On her finger, she wore a ring Ezra had carved for her from a piece of mesquite wood. It was simple and rough, and as honest as the man who had made it. It caught the light sometimes, warm as the Texas sun, steady as the promise they had made to each other without ever speaking the words. They were a family now, a family chosen, claimed, and defended. And here in the wild borderlands between Mexico and Texas, between the life of an outlaw and the hope of redemption, that was more than enough. The frontier was full of second chances, but only for those brave enough to take them. If you enjoyed this story of courage and redemption, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more tales from the lawless frontier. What would you risk for the people you love? Tell us in the comments below. We'll see you in the next story.